Hello, and we are back with Gillian Kenny here at the Irish Pagan School. This is Laura O'Brien, and Dr. Gillian Kenny is one of our esteemed teachers at the school. So has a multitude of classes with us, and there'll be a link below to all the classes, so make sure you do check them out. But today we're going to talk about the Banshee. So, Gillian, your work on the Banshee really weaves the history with the folklore. I know your focus is more the history, but you've definitely dived into the folklore here. So, how do you approach separating fact from myth when you're delving into such ethereal subjects and, quite subjective, really, all the accounts? And what might our community here, Artua, find most surprising about this iconic harbinger?
Okay, so I mean the thing is that I'm well used to in my own researches combining folklore with historical fact. So the reason that's happened is because I come from a perspective of writing women's history. So I've had to look at a whole range of different avenues for women because often women don't appear in the sources.
Mm,
Or if they do appear, then they're, they appear in various guises. And from that, you have to kind of discern what kind of personality he was. So for example, I've had historical women who've lived and who have also kind of morphed into the folklore because of their actions, because of their power. So
mm,
the position they hold in people's psyche has meant that they have become sometimes a grotesque kind of figure, sometimes a figure of real fear. But it tells me, as a historian of women, that this was a uniquely powerful being
mm,
who evoked these strong feelings. So what can I get from the folklore that tells
mm.
me about what the people at the time thought of her
Yeah,
or
yeah.
even later generations? So it adds to the
It
picture.
really, yeah, it
So
really taps into
yeah,
the kind of zeitgeist, right?
yeah.
Yeah,
So you kind of
yeah.
figure it out, you're like, okay, so people in the 19th century, talking about 16th century figure, so people in 19th century were still warning that using her to warn their children, if you don't come in, she's going to get you. So what does that tell you
Mm,
300 years after the fact that she's still like that? And then you get the bits of her life, and she's, started a school, she starts factories, she fights her husband's battles in a way. She's certainly a very strong political figure. So you're like, okay, so something here then. There's something here about the effect she's had. So that's the kind of thing, that's the kind of approach I brought to the Banshee. Of course, the great Patricia Lycett wrote the
mm.
definitive book on it. And that's kind of what she did as well. She sets the folklore within a kind of a structure. So as much as possible, she'll go, right, well, this is apparitions are different, or they're different manifestations depending on region, sometimes parish,
Mhm.
as to what people will see. So let's put that within that. So why here do they only hear her?
Mm.
Why over there do they see a woman with blonde hair in some areas or a woman with white hair in others? So what's that telling us? What's that telling us about urban versus rural experiences of banshees? What's that telling us about areas with strong English cultural influences as opposed to predominantly Gaelic about the banshee? So I guess you have to put it together as a kind of a mosaic, put
Yeah,
some kind of structure on it. We know there's a historical belief in the banshee in Ireland. What's that telling us about what the people believed at different times, about the cultural influences they were subject to, and about what the banshee meant to them? In some areas, she's always a figure of some fear, but in some areas people are weirdly used to her and look upon her as not a particularly malevolent or dangerous figure. And then in
mm,
other areas you will have that. So I think it's a useful kind of coming together of sources to tell us lots and lots about what we need to know about different parts of Ireland at different stages of Ireland's evolution. So I'm very happy to kind of use the folklore as that kind of stepping stone, or as part of that whole jigsaw. In terms of what might surprise people, well, she wasn't a fairy, so
mm. Yeah,
that might surprise them.
yeah,
And she's
yeah.
a fairy woman,
Banshee,
most
Banshee
likely. Yeah.
means fairy woman, but the whole culture of the Banshee was not about the she at all.
No.
No.
No, she's Patricia Lightser calls her a death messenger.
Mm,
Um, she um she represents something in the Irish psyche which presents as paranormal or supernatural. but which does not behave as historically and as through the literature we know, fairy women
Mm.
tend to behave. So there is something there within that. There's obviously something different. But I mean, other things like, for example, she's attached to families. That's not necessarily that's not necessarily believed across the whole of Ireland or necessarily true either. And here's another kind of to add to the nuance of Irish culture and belief and traditions. So the idea that she's attached to certain Gaelic families, the Macs or the O's,
Mm.
um, so you get people, especially in the folklore collections, and they'll talk about the family she's attached to, and you read the list, and they're not traditional Gaelic names.
Mm.
They are
Mm.
hibernicized
Mm.
Norman names or English ones. So, what's that telling us about the process of cultural assimilation and about how people's antecedents are forgotten when they adopt Gaelic beliefs in ways fairly quickly as well
Mm.
in the common imagination? So, yeah, I think the Banshee as a historical figure is really, really useful. It tells us something about in older sources as well. I mean, she's in quite old sources, so she's in medieval sources, but it tells us something about, in general, I think, about how the people who wrote medieval sources, who were men and who were clerics, viewed women.
Mm.
So she's part of a largely misogynistic tradition, but it's both kind of horror and fascination you get
Mm.
with women in
Mm.
the written sources. So, it's written by a clerical elite. They are obviously sometimes attracted to them, but also repelled. They inherit a long Christian tradition of misogyny, which is always going on in their head from people like St. Augustine downwards. So that comes out as well sometimes in the narrative. And then as you go into the modern era, I find it fascinating how the stories have evolved and how they have changed and how they adapt and how banshees in Dublin are different to banshees in Tipperary and why is that? And they seem to account, to allow for like street lamps and, you know, doorbells
Yeah.
and whatever they are, they seem to be adapting
Mm.
and they seem to still live in the psyche even today.
Yeah.
So even today, you'll get stories of people who will hear the banshee,
Mhm.
and it sounds different depending on where in the country you are as well. It can sound different, so that's fascinating because it's a tiny country,
Yeah.
and yet the sound of this being can change depending on if you're one side of a county or another.
Mhm.
So yeah, to me, it's kind of testament. It's like a living manifestation, or like of people's um of the complexity of Irish culture
Mm.
from medieval times until the present. What did she begin as? What she become? Why is she called a banshee? Well, it's one way of framing her, and it's the only way people kind of had at the time because a fairy woman is a supernatural woman. But is she a
Mm.
fairy woman? No,
Well,
most likely
considering
not.
that,
She's
like
something else.
the she or the other world would also have very strong death and ghost connections as well. The she and the ghosts are not the same, but there is a crossover. And even as you're
Yeah.
describing, the medieval literati, the treatment of the banshee, it's very reminiscent of my studies with the Morrigan. And, there's even a crossover there as well. People get confused between the Morrigan and the banshee and the washer at the ford and the bive. And, there's all of this kind of blend going on. But it really, to me, just listening to you there, it really is kind of proof of something that we always say here at the Irish Pagan School, is that these are living traditions, very, very much so,
Yeah. Yeah.
very embedded into our culture, very much a part of who and how we are, how we exist in this world. My own kids, their friends have banshee stories, so
Mhm.
this is absolutely ongoing. And like these are kids who, like my kids would have grown up with it, but their friends wouldn't have necessarily. Like my generation kind of stopped a lot of this,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
moved on, if you like. But so why are their
Yeah.
kids now talking about the banshee or hearing the banshee, or it's just part of it, and it's so
She's
embedded in.
also gone into modern culture
Mm.
outside of Ireland as well, which I also find fascinating. And she's hypersexualized, which is also interesting because in Ireland she is kind of she's in some ways she can be seen as a manifestation of a Kyloch figure. So
Mm. Mm.
she appears as a hag, and in a way, I think to the Irish mind, sometimes that can be of immense comfort because, of course, women were there at the time of death. Women
Mm.
cleaned up after the dead. Women
Mm-hmm.
got the dead ready. There's a kind of there's a comfort in knowing
The
that those traditions are
continuity.
there,
Yeah,
that
yeah,
women will look after you, and that a woman will tell you when you're when death is approaching. Not your death, but someone in the
yeah.
family. So I think there's a kind of a comfort to that which you don't get in a modern hypersexualized version of the
And
Banshee.
I
I think
find
that
that a
goes
lot of
with
those are
it.
coming from outside the culture though, and this is
Indeed.
the big issue,
Yes.
this,
Yeah.
like, we're talking
Yeah.
about living traditions, but it has to be rooted in these like ancestral memories that we have in the norms of the actual live and breathe in Irish culture and traditions here on the island, because when it goes elsewhere, it gets misunderstood. It's like a game of telephone or whispers, and it just becomes something that it's completely not. So it is important to go back to source, folks, and that's what we're trying to do here. So, Gillian, we're going to leave that for this video. This is part of a playlist, so make sure you check the link at the end for the rest of the playlist and all of Gillian's classes on the Banshee and on many other fascinating topics with regard to Irish history, Irish folklore, Irish mythology, Irish magic. We're going to delve into cursing, I think, in one of these videos, which is always
Oh,
fascinating. Yeah, we'll
we
go
like a
there.
curse.
Yeah, we'll go there.
Nothing wrong with a bit of cursing.
and
I tell you.
yeah, check the links below and we'll see you in the next video. Slán.
Thanks, everyone.